critically important work of this committee. I want to thank President O'Grady, who's president of the Franklin County Board of Commissioners, and his colleagues, Commissioner Boyce and Commissioner Brown as well, for their partnership. Council President Harden, who I'll introduce in just a moment for some comments, Director Mike Stevens, our chair, Christy Angel, and for today's session, our subject expert panelists, all six of you. Thank you for joining us and being part of this today. I don't think anyone will argue with me that the last several months have been truly unprecedented. A global pandemic, a health crisis, a human services crisis, an economic crisis, national reckoning over racial injustice and police brutality, a spike in violence, especially youth violence, and the most divisive election in our lifetime. We know and understand that this COVID-19 recession is one of the worst we've experienced. It's resulted in a public health crisis that continues to disproportionately negatively impact minorities, low-wage workers, and young people. Additionally, the ensuing human services crisis and the economic challenges will have an even greater negative economic impact. According to the Washington Post article included in the packet of information you received this week, quote, white Americans have recovered more than half of their jobs lost between February and April. Meanwhile, Black Americans have recovered just over 1/3 of employment lost in the pandemic. Black women and mothers of school-aged children are taking the longest time to regain their employment, end quote. These realities and many others underscore my vision for this committee's work, which is to provide advice and counsel on how the city, public sector, nonprofit, and our private sector partners can support an inclusive economic recovery strategy, build community resiliency, promote shared prosperity, and better position all residents to endure future economic challenges. What we saw after the Great Recession was how dramatically different the recovery was over the last 10 years. One of the things we need to learn from is to take a different approach and approach this dynamic, inclusive recovery through the lens of equity. The resources and investments we make during this difficult economic time will have an incredible impact over the type of recovery we see in this community. It's imperative that our economic recovery strategy addresses the economic disparities that existed prior to COVID-19, while also promoting inclusive growth post-COVID-19. Please know that your commitment to this committee is appreciated, and this work is incredibly important to the city of Columbus. I thank each and every one of you for leaning into this work over the next several months as we aspire to make lasting changes that our community desperately needs and work towards an equitable and inclusive economic recovery for our community. Before I introduce the chair of the committee, I would like to acknowledge Commissioner O'Grady, who cannot be here with us today, but has agreed to serve on the committee. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Council President Shannon Harden and invite him to share some remarks. President Harden?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to our chair, Christy Angel, to my colleague, President O'Grady. On behalf of my colleagues, just want to acknowledge Council's commitment to stand shoulder to shoulder, not only with the mayor, but with each and every one of our partners as we go about the important work of our recovery. I just stepped out of a race and equity training that Council is participating in right now, and it's a good reminder of how our policies can affect where we are now, but where we go from here. We are going through incredibly challenging times, but out of challenge also gives birth to opportunity. It's our opportunity now to build the community, the Columbus that we want to, by stacking hands, coming up with policies and practices that will lift all of Columbus and try and attempt to create a more equitable community. And so I appreciate all the work that will go into this committee. I appreciate your time and your leadership. and look forward to working with each and every one of you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thanks for your comments, commitment, and all the work on helping to get this group together and organized and off the ground. It's now my pleasure to introduce our chair, Christy Angel, who can provide her thoughts, a more in-depth look at each phase of the work ahead, and share her timeline. Thank you, Christy. I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council President Harden. And obviously, also thank you to the county commissioners, one for, not only giving us all the opportunity to shape what recovery, a resilient recovery looks like for the sectors and the areas that we're going to be looking at over these next few months, but also thank you all for having the foresight and the vision to bring us together, and to be specific about the things that we're going to be looking at. It's easy to try to boil the ocean in these types of efforts, but I think what is difficult is when you try to look at some very specific pieces of work, some very specific industries or sectors, and then what is even more difficult is for us to start thinking about equity. And so to my colleagues here today, we're going to be spending a lot of time together. And so for those of you who maybe this is your first time on a mayoral or a council appointment, some of us, we've been around the block a little bit, and this won't be our first time. We'll be there right there with you, though, because, there's going to be a lot of work and some data to review. We're going to hear from a number of experts in this first phase, as you've probably seen in the calendar. So we'll call this our listening phase, if you will, and our learning phase. But also, as experts will come forward and talk about their sector or their industries, and they will talk about how COVID-19 has unveiled perhaps some inequities and some challenges. We'll also be thinking about where the opportunities are, and you will bring your expertise also to the table when it is when it is the industry that you represent. So don't be shy, because you also have very specific knowledge, and we want to make sure that you are included in those conversations, even though we have some other colleagues and friends coming forward to talk about these areas. I don't need to go over all the areas. I think everyone is very, is aware of the specific areas that we're going to discuss. And then we're going to go to, phase 2. So if you think about, just maybe before the holiday, we're probably going to get to phase 2. We'll take a break and get through the holidays. And we will pick up the work. I think Mike and Hannah and I have talked about perhaps right after the new year. We'll pick up phase 2, and we'll start to go through some work groups. We'll have some facilitation. I think we may have a facilitator on the here with us today. Kinston, welcome. Kinston's going to be doing some facilitation. We've heard great things about your work, so welcome. And we'll start to talk about solutions and recommendations. And here is where we will want to be creative and innovative. But again, we'll have the backdrop of equity. And I hope that I have the chance to bring some very specific instructions about equity to each committee and to the foundation of this work at some point, so that we can always go back to what equity is. It's not equality. We're talking about equity. Ultimately, we'll get to justice, which is really about fixing, a system, and going very deep. But right now, we're going to be talking about, equity and making sure that as we recover from this pandemic or these pandemics, that we come back stronger than ever before. And then our phase 3 work will be quarterly meetings. And why do we need quarterly meetings? Because we want to have updates. We want to see, what work is being done. We want to have report outs. We want to be able to measure our success and share our success more broadly, because oftentimes when you do this kind of work, it can also be replicated across sectors, across industries. And I'm sure that that's part of the legacy that we can leave the city. And as I mentioned, the legacy that we leave the city and the county, our work is not just for the city and the county. We are advisory, and we are going to be making some recommendations, but obviously there will be work for us to do as well. And so oftentimes, as we go through this effort, you will see that there are some things that belong in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, in the government sector, and we should be reminded to call that out. And we should also be reminded that, you know, when it calls for our sector to do that work, whatever sector you're in, that we take that back to the boards or to the leaders and to our sector partners, because this responsibility is not government's alone. This responsibility, it's really on all of our shoulders to start this work. And so I look forward to what we're going to do together. I think that what we can create can be something that can be replicated perhaps in other jurisdictions. And again, I want to thank the mayor, the council president, and the county commissioners for bringing us together, for allowing me, to just be, like I said, I think I told Mike Stevens, it's just a conductor of an orchestra, and just really here to kind of keep the trains moving on time, and then to work with all of my colleagues across many sectors and to meet new friends and colleagues as well. I think we're all probably ready to get to work. I know I am ready to be forward, start to look forward, and I'm kind of ready to, I know I can't completely leave behind where we are right now, but I am ready to start looking at the days ahead. And so let's get to work. And today we'll have our first guest who will join us and come and bring kind of a level set around the economy and workforce, and we are excited to receive those presentations. One final thing I will also say is from time to time, we will send articles to read and those kinds of things. We do not mean to inundate you with information, but as we get up-to-date information, we want to make sure that we update the committee in real time. So you will receive articles and so forth as we continue to learn more, and get more detailed information about the recovery and where we are in this pandemic and where we are in our economy. So we don't want to inundate you, but we do want to make sure that we inform you. Thank you, Mayor, again for the opportunity, and I will turn it over to, am I turning it over to you, Hannah?
You're welcome to, because I'm just going to kick it right over to our first speaker on economic base this afternoon, and that's going to be Jung Kim from One Columbus.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jung. I'm the research director for One Columbus, and I'm going to take you through a few data points about how we're looking at the economy and the key industries here. I'm just going to share the screen, and hopefully this works. Can everyone see the screen okay? Right. I'll just dive right in. Before I get into the industries, first zooming out a little bit, we look at unemployment and what's happened across the country. It went up dramatically in April and has been trending down ever since. What you see in the dark red is our temporary layoffs, so the furloughs and things like that. The bright red are the permanent job losses. And what's happened over time since April is that the temporary losses have been coming down, but the permanent losses are starting to pile up. And, this is a concern for us because this is approaching probably what the kind of the steady state equilibrium in the economy is going to look like for a while now in terms of the larger permanent losses. We've looked at this data by race and ethnicity, and the mayor's completely right. The gap has widened. Pre-COVID, white unemployment rate was at 3% versus Black at 6%. And now those figures are 7 and 12 respectively. So that gap has increased from 3 percentage points to 5. And same thing with the Latinx population and the Asian American population as well. We have 6 key industry sectors identified in our One Columbus strategy and as part of our day-to-day work. So I'm not going to go into detail on all of this, but what we've done is take the U.S. unemployment monthly data, try to take out take the industries that they report at. It's not at a very detailed level, unfortunately, but we try to line them up with the key industries. So when we look at automotive with the major Honda presence here in their supply chain, we look at the motor vehicle and parts manufacturing, which was down significantly back in April with the gray bars. It's come back a lot, but still negative year on year. But we're also looking at the kind of the front end side, right, with the auto dealers, same kind of pattern. The biggest losses have been in retail, and especially apparel retail, which is very important for us when you consider companies like L Brands and Abercrombie, DSW, all those that are here, and I'll get into that later. That third box, our finance and insurance, it's been mostly flat. We know that back in March, April, companies like Chase froze their hiring completely, right? So normally they have 500 or so job postings in the region, and that went down to pretty much zero. It's come back a lot since. They're at about 300 right now, for example, but it's not all the way where it was before. And we're seeing this across companies in the finance and insurance space. Logistics, e-commerce, that's been a major boon for the region, and I'll get into that, what's that meant in terms of job postings and industrial construction. Biohealth, this data shows it being flat, but we're starting to see opportunities emerge there. It may be kind of the leading light for the recovery in office property, hopefully. And then finally, advanced computing, things like data centers and all the hardware and software that go behind that. The employment side is somewhat flat, but we're seeing opportunities there in terms of our project pipeline. Obviously, many of us are working remote, studying remote, or checking in with our doctor remotely. So it matters a lot that this is one of our key industries. It's going to go into retail a little bit, and I think this, whether it's unemployment or a lot of these economic data, it's going to tell the story about what we're going to see. Because when you look at it at the aggregate level, retail sales in September in the U.S. were actually up 5% year on year. So it's pretty amazing considering all that's happening, right? But when you break it down by categories, the landscape has clearly shifted. So the gainers, non-store retailers, that's e-commerce like Amazon, up 24%, building material and garden. Everyone has been doing home improvement projects, so that's up 19. Sporting goods, that saw a major spike in the summer as people were kind of getting back to reopening, and youth sports leagues and all that. So those have seen increases. But on the right side, you see restaurants, the food service, drinking places. Apparel is still down, below normal, and then gas stations are also there. So it's a mixed story of what's happening. If you're just purely looking at it at an academic lens, it's really fascinating, right? Just all the stuff that's in flux. But we know that this kind of stuff has real life impacts on people in the community. These retail sales are bubbling up all the way to the headquarters, right? So we're tracking LinkedIn profiles here in the Columbus area of major retail employers, the month-to-month change in the profile counts. So even before COVID, this was an issue for a lot of companies that have been challenged by Amazon and e-commerce in general. And what's happened with the pandemic has accelerated that. So you see some of the big dips that companies like Ascena, designer brands, L Brands have had in recent months. This is something that we're working desperately in terms of keeping that talent here, whether it's fashion design, buying, merchandising, or even the back office functions around tech, finance. Some of the people will switch to other industries, but at the same time, we're on the lookout for the better performing retailers and specialty retailers. And, hopefully that's a way that we can keep the people and the jobs here. On the real estate side, what's happened in the past 2 quarters is that many of the markets, including Columbus, have gone net negative in terms of absorption. So too much supply is coming on the market where tenants don't renew leases or they terminate them early. If there's a silver lining to any of this, it's that Columbus, despite the loss, negative net absorption of more than 500,000 square feet in the last 2 quarters, we're sort of in there with the Austins, Denver, San Jose's of the world. So the economies like us and those out west that were pretty high flying before COVID are among those that are hit the hardest. On the industrial side, it's a very different story. Columbus had record levels of industrial construction going into this. In the last quarter, in Q3, more than 5 million square feet of industrial space came to completion. And even those off the books out of the pipeline, the pipeline is still at pretty much record levels in the region, higher than any point in the decade still before 2019. And here's what that looks like from a job postings perspective. We've been tracking job postings pretty much real time, trying to get a sense of what's going on. You got a few categories here. In the yellow, orange are the logistics, transportation job postings in the Columbus region. They're way up compared to where they were earlier in the year. But then you have other areas like IT, which is probably half about the pre-COVID levels. So there's this shift, right, with the logistics up, manufacturing jobs are in demand from employers, but then areas like IT, management, business operations, finance are down compared to where they were region. So what's happened is that the city's share of job postings has declined relative to the region. At the start of this, the job postings in the city were 62% of the regions, and now it's about half. So as the postings have recovered, as jobs have started to come back, areas outside in the outer counties have benefited a little bit more rapidly than the city. We're also seeing this in the unemployment rate and the unemployment claims, which we track relative to the labor force. The data doesn't go at the city level, but looking at just Columbus region, the 11 county region that we cover versus just Franklin County. Normally they move in tandem, and you saw this in February, March in terms of the claims or the unemployment rates, and even at the start of the lockdown in April. But as the economy reopened, you have the black lines, the black striped dots, where Franklin County's unemployment has remained higher than the rest of the region. So if you think about some of the things I talked about in office, or even the kind of the frontline retail, you got the hotels, travel, hospitality, all of that, those are suffering even more, and it's created this differential that we normally don't see between Franklin County and the rest of the region. This is my final slide, and I don't know if we're going to take questions right after or wait a little bit. I'm fine either way. But in summary, we do see opportunities across certain industries. I mentioned e-commerce, anything around the home. All of us are stuck at home. So home building, home improvement, furniture, home goods, garden supplies, they're all doing well. And from a project standpoint in economic development, we're definitely looking in those spaces. Basic consumer goods, pet food or pet food, personal care, grooming, whether for people or pets, all of those are in heavy demand. So manufacturing, distribution opportunities are there as well. Data centers, communications technology is another hot area. And then looking a bit more long-term, we've definitely been doing more with biohealth and especially genomics, some of the research activity coming out from places like Nationwide Children's Hospital. Automotive, despite its challenges, it's bounced back quite a bit, but we think a lot of the future is in electrification. So not just the electric vehicles themselves, but all the parts that go into it, even the paint coatings required to protect the equipment and the battery. So there's a lot happening with the supply chain there. And then finally, for Columbus overall, as companies think about consolidations, what to do with their future real estate, and needing to control costs, we think it's a competitive location, especially compared to the expensive coastal cities for companies to do business here. Even with these opportunities, there are significant constraints around the talent workforce side, which I'm sure the next panel will get into. Lack of childcare, in-person schooling, that's definitely one issue that's holding people back from being able to join the workforce full time. There is this mismatch between the available labor, even though unemployment rate is high, it doesn't quite line up with the skills that are in demand. So we're definitely working with our higher ed partners to try to figure out how to address that. And then finally, and this kind of ties into what we're seeing in housing, there's just lower levels of migration across the U.S. It's put pressure on housing inventories and prices. And, from a workforce standpoint, there's less opportunity here to try to match up the right skills to the right places where those skills are in demand. So those are some of the issues that we're wrestling with right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you, John, can you do one thing for us before we move on to Kerwin? Can you just quickly, I just want to make sure everyone has the, kind of starts from the same, base of knowledge in Columbus region versus Franklin County.
Sure. So our region covers 11 counties. It's Franklin and the surrounding counties, plus 4 more counties to the north, Logan, Marion, Morrow, and Knox.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Madam Chair, could I ask a question of Jung before we move on?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So, Jung, there were a couple of slides from a deck that I think a consultant that One Columbus had engaged earlier this year, I thought did an incredible job kind of reflecting and capturing the lack of equity in the recovery from the Great Recession. Are you remembering back to that meeting and briefing? I'm wondering if you would be willing to track that down and maybe share that with this group, and any initial insights, what lessons learned from the recovery from the Great Recession should this committee and should we all be contemplating to make sure that our recovery is more equitable and inclusive?
Sure, Mayor, I can definitely look into that. I think the last recession had some of the same issues. Hopefully for us this time, lessons learned, because we know that even then the recovery wasn't even, right, across the demographics and other characteristics. So yeah, I'll definitely look into that and send that to the group.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Mayor. I think we will turn it over now to Kyle Strickland and Beverly Vanderveer from Kerwin.
Thank you so much. Beverly, do you want to kick us off?
I will. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Kerwin Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, I want to thank Mayor Ginther and staff for inviting Kerwin to be part of the process of rebuilding and increasing the resilience through inclusion in Columbus. We had just previously been involved in the mayor's recent initiative on financial empowerment roadmap, financial security for women and families in Columbus, that was just published in September. What I'm going to share this afternoon may not be new, but I hope to provide another lens or perspective to see the concerns differently, which in turn may shift the process to create recommendations and directives toward real economic inclusion. I'm not going to share my slides because they're basically more text versus tables, but I definitely will have them available to you as you begin your deliberation. Now, one of the things that I said was real economic inclusion, and I think Mayor Ginther and I are on the same page regarding where history can take us. So because the U.S. has been down the path of economic inclusion sometime with no real change occurring. So we must use history as a prologue to shape more lasting changes than before. So let me just sort of say that everybody agrees that the scale and speed of the economic collapse has been unprecedented in our American history. and then we saw what happened over the 2-month lockdown period. Since that lockdown, the local leaders have been under increasing pressure to return to normal as quickly as possible. And the question that I raised, that I think Mayor Ginther raised, is what is normal and for whom? While the pandemic has laid bare the racial inequalities, as in jobs, education, health, technology, these inequalities were pre-existent. In essence, the normal was not cutting it for significant segments of the American population. So the U.S. economic pattern that I've observed and policymakers have been noting is that the growing economic divide, where wealth and opportunity were more concentrated with a small percentage of people for some time, way before the pandemic. According to the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, just out this past year, out of nearly 200 metropolitan areas, which is about 80% of the U.S. population, exactly 0 managed to grow their economies, raise standards of living, and reduce gaps by income, race, and place consistently within that 10-year period from 2008 to 2018. In the mid-2010s, of about half of the U.S. workforce, which is about 44%, 54% of Black workers and 63% Latino or Hispanic workers earn less than a family-sustaining wage. This evidence provides these figures provide evidence that the low-paying service jobs have proliferated throughout metro areas' economy. So in essence, Brookings has shown that the substantial racial and economic disparities have existed prior to COVID-19, and that local economies were not maximizing the potential of the people in their communities. By nearly every measure that I have examined, racial ethnic minorities are behind in comparison to whites on indicators of economic well-being and definitely wealth. And so I'm not telling people anything new. The only thing that COVID has laid bare is that the wealth gap has even increased even more, and that technology or technological businesses have become more advantaged. And as they become more advantaged, as Young Kim just talked about, small retail businesses, brick and mortar businesses are losing out faster to online retail giants. Okay, so there's been a continued existence with this COVID. But the other thing they've laid bare is the double bind that low-paid workers, particularly racial ethnic minorities, experience. One of losing jobs, but at the same time requiring to go to be essential workers in jobs. The other thing that's been interesting is that if you look at the CARES Act, for Black and Latina small business owners, they were less likely to receive initial support from the CARES Act programs, which jeopardized their own enterprises and individual and community wealth. So we already know there are rising job loss for Blacks and Latinos. We know that by race and gender, as the mayor indicated, and so I don't need to go over that. And we know that that begins to be a trickling impact or tsunami impact on housing, childcare, education, and so on. So at this point, we must be vigilant and mindful of being inclusive. And as the mayor indicated, history does not show many successful cases of inclusive economic transformation or recovery. And I do hope that Columbus can be the exception. So as the mayor indicated, the Great Recession of 2008 showed that the recovery exacerbated the racial disparities. It took Black workers longer than others to regain lost ground on employment and earnings. And even in 2019, home ownership rates for Blacks and Latina households remained below the 2006 levels and roughly 50% lower than the white households. Now, this issue, and this is a hard one to tackle, reflects the powerful adherence to a status quo economic development approach that prioritize short-run job creation with no long-term plan to reduce inequalities. And even examples of where local leaders, really were concerned about taking on the issue of racial inequity, they address them separately and usually much later in the business cycle. And those are two things that I would say that this is great that this group is here, because the proactive aspect must be looking at inequity early on and not activating that later on. So if it goes later on in the process, they know that it has always favored the privileged, as we've already seen by the CARE Act, creates more inequities, and then it also results in an erosion of trust, an erosion of resilience, and then you're leaving a lot of people on the sidelines. An example of somebody who tried to be proactive and they found that even just being proactive was not enough is what happened after Hurricane Katrina. That when New Orleans decided to rebuild, they started with the initiative of being more equitable, more resilient, boosting entrepreneurship, building codes, overall criminal justice, and adopting resilient strategies. What they found, though, that by 2018, those in the greater New Orleans area were earning lower incomes than before the storm of 2005. The New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice described the local economy as still embedded, and this is quotation marks, plantation tradition, with Black workers relegated to low-wage service workers jobs that support tourism and predominantly white industries. So the past does not have to be the prologue, but to rebuild better with a commitment to quality and equity means that you've got to begin to start infusing throughout the local recovery strategies ways to help those communities to transcend the weaknesses that have continually plagued racial and ethnic minority communities. So to that end, I would like to offer 3 C's that you might want to consider in your planning for racial inclusion. One is commitment. This aspect is obvious in the fact that even Columbus had the resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis and the formation of this advisory force. Context, keeping the economic history of the racial ethnic communities in mind. Go beyond, or I should say, go back to the pre-pandemic statistics of Columbus and the Franklin County area to understand the state of racial disparities that need to be addressed. To look at the pandemic numbers may result in initiatives that maintain the status quo. And then the last C is capacity. To address racial disparities, more will be needed, which may be challenging for some to accept because it will seem like a lot. So if you think it is a lot, it probably is. However, inequality will not lessen when the focus is on the status quo. Inequality will continue to grow. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I hope the comments have been helpful in any way that Kerwin and I can be helpful in supporting an equitable life for all. But, we're available. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Kyle.
Thanks so much, Beverly. Really appreciate that. We are lucky here at Ohio State in Kerwin to have Beverly join us and really for this community. And thank you so much, Mayor and Christy, for bringing us here today, and all of you guests that are here and as panelists on this committee to move forward. So a lot has been discussed, and a lot of the through line throughout this process is really about racial equity and what that means moving forward. I am working currently on a research paper with our former executive director, Derek Hamilton, who's an economist who's done a lot of work in this space, especially looking at the aspect of wealth and its impacts on communities. Without the wealth, you don't have that sort of financial security to move forward that is essential when we're talking about protection from loss, protection from risk, and of course, recovery moving forward. So there's a couple of main points that I want to highlight. First is in ways that this recession is similar to past recessions, but also what is unique about this recession. So obviously the differences about this recession is that This was brought on, it was intentionally brought on as a result of a policy response to shut down the economy in order to stop the spread of the COVID-19 virus. And so in addition to the economic crisis that we're dealing with and navigating with, we also have to deal with the health impacts of the pandemic. However, what's important for us to also keep in mind is what's similar. And this, and to Beverly's point earlier, and John's point as well, is the similar nature of this pandemic is that throughout all of this recovery process and the recession, there is a through line, which is racial inequity. We continue to see that in most recessions, unemployment increases among Black people, followed by Latinx people. And in this recession, not only are we seeing that in our unemployment numbers and our economic numbers, we're also seeing the devastating health consequences and impacts of this pandemic. So this, again, has exacerbated the inequalities that have persisted long before this pandemic. And to Beverly's point, which is so critical, we really need to continue to highlight, these issues existed prior to the pandemic, and our social safety net was fraying prior to the pandemic. And let alone with the situation that we are in now, we are only seeing inequality grow. And if we come up with the same responses, we make the same mistakes of the last recession, then our recovery will be anemic. And that is important for us to really keep in mind. We have this conversation right now about, what we witnessed was a rapid onset and collapse of our economy, right? We saw from March to April alone, more jobs were disappeared from our nation's payrolls and lost over the entirety of the Great Recession, or able to see that these rates increased over time from February to June. This is something that we need to understand, that this collapse was intense, but the recovery alone is what we're starting to see is a K-shaped recovery. So this is this idea that what's happening is after the $2.2 trillion CARES Act from the federal government, along with additional stimulus, what we've seen is that you are actually having corporations and those that are more well off and individuals that are more well off are relatively comfortable. They're still hurt. They're still impacted by this recession and by this pandemic, but they were less likely to lose jobs. They're less likely to hemorrhage jobs, as we saw with low-wage earners and with low-wage workers, with small businesses, with Black and minority-owned businesses. Many of those jobs and those businesses are never coming back. And that's something that we have to recognize, because as Beverly and others have pointed out too, this idea that we can just return to normal when a time before the pandemic was never normal is something that we need to make sure we're continuing to hit over and over again. And ultimately, as city leaders, as community leaders, this also demands an intensive federal response. There's no way that we can recover from this pandemic at the city level, at the county and state levels, without an intense infusion of federal resources from the Federal Reserve and the federal government, because we need that in order to balance out the damages and the collapse and the austerity that we have seen, where people are having to tighten their budgets, make layoffs occur over time. And so I think one of the things is that we all need to recognize that this doesn't happen in a vacuum. This is part of a larger context that we are in. So not only do we have to advocate for local policies at the local level, we also understand that there's limitations for how far those dollars and how far those policies can go. So that federal advocacy is key as well in order to make sure we get those pieces together. And I know we're at time. So a couple quick points that we need. We need intense support from state and local governments and sectors that need the most help. This means we have to actually target our aid to sectors like education. So when it comes to reopening our schools, we need to make sure that they have the protective equipment and resources to be able to open safely. We also know that the schools that are able to reopen oftentimes are not the same as those that are in predominantly Black and brown communities that are still struggling and to really over the health effects and the economic effects of this pandemic. Without access to adequate childcare, that's a struggle that we also need to be addressing. And we also need to make sure we expand unemployment benefits and provide additional loans and direct employment for our workers. That is a critical piece that we need to have. And then ultimately, we need to invest and build out our public safety net. And this is something that community leaders, both nonprofits, but also in the business sector, need to really invest in. That business cannot do this alone, governments cannot do this alone, but we do need a well-funded public sector safety net to ensure that people have the security they need to thrive. And this is critical because we talk about this when it comes to our lenses of racial equity. Right now, we're hearing conversations across the country and within our own community that people are committed to talking about racial equity. However, how do we make sure that those statements go beyond just statements? What does it look like when we're actually setting goals? What does it look like with your hiring practices? What does your board look like? Is that reflective? How are you ensuring that your engagement, your investment in the community is actually promoting equity? It requires working in and with the community. And all the leaders here in this committee have the opportunity to make sure we're continuing to push. And the last thing that I'll say is that as much as we also want to talk about all the good that we are doing in communities and through our businesses and governments, we also have to recognize what policies are we implementing that are harming our communities. And we have to roll back some of those policies and don't advocate for policies that don't target the investments and the resources and highlight racial equity front and center. So with that, we'll open it up with questions, but I just thank you all so much for giving us the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. Hannah, I just want to do one quick check. Do you want to have Lisa share her slides now and before we go into the panel discussion, or do you want to go ahead and have questions at the Q&A?
Let's go ahead and do questions for the entire economic base panel. So Jung, Beverly, and Kyle, and then we'll switch over to job readiness.
Perfect. The floor is open for questions.
This is Ariana. I have a question. This is to Jung. In the numbers specifically pertaining to the Latino community, were undocumented, are undocumented members of the community taken into consideration? Because the numbers that I've heard for the segment of the community that has been most heavily impacted with COVID has been the undocumented sector, and especially Latinas who are, there's very little flexibility as far as their jobs in order to be able to work and support their kids that are now studying from home.
I haven't seen data on the document status. Definitely know that the Latinx population and the Latino population in particular have been affected by the types of jobs that they're concentrated in, right? It is often frontline retail or hospitality. So there's definitely information about that. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else in the group has information about the document.
I agree. I have seen some of that data, and it's very interesting because it flips and flops. Because at the height of the pandemic, it was the undocumented who were Latina who were hit the most. And then as the recovery started to occur and the unemployment started to drop, it flipped where it was the citizen immigrants that were experiencing slightly more unemployment. But overall, across both of those, it were women. And so you were correct. And one of the issues about women, they know in gender, regarding gender, there's been a higher unemployment rate, more of them leaving the workforce. And so the question is, the implication is, does this have to do with childcare? And so it's a very interesting set of data. I haven't looked at the most latest trends, but the last one that I had read about was in June, and where they saw the flip, where the unemployment got slightly higher for the citizen immigrants versus the undocumented.
This is Rachel Lester with Catholic Social Services. I'm sorry, I'm having tech issues. I'll get through chat.
Yeah, just a little feedback there. While Rachel's fixing her think she's adding her question to the chat. Annie Ross Womack, who's representing NAACP, has a question.
Thanks, Christy. I do have a question. As we were talking from the Kerwin Institute, as we were talking about recovery and next steps, we're talking about implementing a plan to dial back some of the things that are already in existence. I mean, my question is, would it be more beneficial for us to look at those things that are already in existence and start dialing those back, and at the same time as implementing new things? Because it's the past has taught us we have to correct some things to move forward. Can we do that in concert? And what would that look like?
So I would say that's a great question, and I would say yes. I think we have to do both things at the same time. I mean, the first thing we have to do is we have to identify what is already going on, what's already in place, and ensuring that those policies, those practices that have been set, whether it's at a city level, at a county level, at a regional level, are being implemented, and then ensuring that we are working on those specific policies that actually we're following through on. So, for example, what tends to happen is that there are big moments like this, like what we're facing right now, and there's plans that happen, and there's committees that form, and there's task forces that are made, and then there are goals that are set, right? But then another crisis hits or something else happens over time, and so as a result, what ends up happening is that you might have some goals or some recommendations that end up sitting on the shelf. And so the question really is, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity with this committee to be able to actually push and hold folks accountable to ensure that we have a long-lasting recovery and that we're putting principles of racial equity first. And what's important about putting those principles first is making sure that people are on the same page about what racial equity even means, right? Because there are a lot of people who say racial equity, we're gonna center these issues, but when it actually comes down to implementation and sometimes even design, our racial equity we don't actually end up moving that forward. And it's important for us to recognize what are some of the disproportionate impacts of so-called race neutral policies. What are the impacts when you cut healthcare, when you cut social safety net? All these have disproportionate impacts on Black and Latinx communities. And so as a result, we have to make sure that we're recognizing, okay, some of these policies in the past have done harm. And here's the thing, what I will say that especially when it comes to recessions, but when it comes out of recovery or any sort of situation that we're in, financial literacy programs and just workforce development and job training alone will not get us to where we need to be. We need to make sure we're substantially investing in wealth building opportunities, and that requires addressing kind of our tax code at the federal level, but also at the policy level, ensuring that philanthropy, businesses do what we can to make sure that we're providing the proper investments in our public sector to ensure that our communities of color are getting the resources that they need. So I would say we reflect on what we have done in the past, as well as develop new policies and set goals and hold us accountable to those goals moving forward.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you.
Rachel, you want to ask your question, and then we'll go to Karen Warbitzer from Jewish Family Services. Okay, she's going to put it in the chat. Let's see, Karen.
Okay, hi, I'm Karen Mosener from Jewish Family Services, and I'm wondering if any of the panelists have data around age of those who are most affected. I'm hearing from my staff that as this goes on longer and longer, we're seeing more and more older adults be affected, both on the workforce side and seniors, of course, but I know we'll talk more about that in the future. But on the workforce side, we're seeing more and more older adults.
Well, what I've read is there's still I don't know where that feedback is coming from. There is an age-related piece, but the interesting thing about the age piece that is powerful, no matter how much you slice and dice it, it's all about race. It doesn't matter if you talk about younger people, middle-aged people, older people. The racial inequality is the core piece that runs through it. And, you know, and I'm going to send some references and some articles to Heather that sort of highlighted some of these graphs that have looked at it by age, and where you see effect for the low income, it's going to be for the Latinx, the younger people in the Latinx are more affected, whereas you may see in the older community a more of a difference in the racial divide. But I think what's really powerful about this, it doesn't matter what it is, the racial inequality, it runs a thread across all age groups, even if they try to factor in age.
I think the age factor is it's really mixed, and it probably depends on the industry and the function. I think there are, at least anecdotally, I've seen a number of cases where companies may be going in a much more tech type direction, and in those cases, it's been, you know, we're used to last hired, first fired, right? But in those cases, it actually was, you know, first hired and first fired, right? They were interested in maybe younger people with more of the software or other skills they're looking for. But again, that's only a part of the economy, and the age effects are different in other areas.
Thank you. Thank you. In the interest of time, we're going to do a couple of things. Anyone else who may have a question for our panelists, please put your questions in the chat. Hannah is making note of them, and we'll get those questions to our panelists. I have just one quick question. John, my question is, you know, you showed that slide that had the Columbus region, you know, kind of jobs kind of continuing to kind of climb up, and then the Franklin County, the line, I think it was the black line that was, you know, trailing behind. And usually when those are more, you know, kind of going together, is that because the types of jobs in the region tend to be the types of jobs that are also coming back? So for instance, you know, Amazon is out in Etna, Ohio, or, you know, something like that, and they're growing jobs, but yet jobs in the city don't represent those same sectors and industries that are, the jobs are coming back more quickly. Is there a correlation there?
Yes, that's right. I was trying to, as part of what I was trying to hint at. I mean, within the city boundaries, you do have, or Franklin County boundaries, you do have some of those functions like an Amazon or manufacturing, but it's not at the concentration levels that you see in the outer counties. So some of the northern counties, like a Knox or Marion, Union, you know, manufacturing represents 25-30% of employment there, and it's 8% of Franklin County's employment. So that's where you see the differences emerge, in that you know, some of those industries where their strength right now on the industrial side are less concentrated in Franklin.
Okay. Thank you. So something for us to note as we now move to, thank you all. First, let me say thank you, Beverly, Kyle, and John, for your presentations. And again, panel or committee members, if you have questions specifically for the panel that weren't answered during this period, please put those questions in the chat, and Hannah will get those questions to our panelists. And again, as I have said before, as updated information becomes available, there's a chance that we may have our panelists back, or at least have some of their information back before us. Now we will turn it over to Lisa Pat McDaniel. We like to call her the jobs lady, with the Workforce Development Board of Central Ohio. Lisa, floor is yours.
Thank you. So actually, I'm not doing this alone. I'm going to have my colleagues, Bo Chilton from Impact and Beth Gifford from Columbus Works. And what we're going to do, first of all, on behalf of them and myself, I want to thank you for the opportunity to address the committee on the state of the workforce and our recommendations on what the community will need to do to recover. And certainly, this is a long list. We're just going to take a part of that list. Also, I should warn you that I was raring to go because you're asking questions that I have a little bit more of an answer for. So hopefully this will add to the body of knowledge. We're going to do an overview of the current state of the workforce. We're going to talk a little bit about the workforce system and things the system is trying to do to mitigate the challenges posed by COVID-19 and going forward. We're going to talk about what is happening on the ground with residents and employers, and we have recommendations. As I said, if we have time, I guess we'll open it up for discussion and questions, or you can get those to us and we will answer them. First, I want to level set where we were pre-COVID-19. According to a Women's Fund study, a single parent with 2 children needs $26 an hour to cover living expenses. Given that 1 in 3 households in our community is headed by a woman, the difference between a $15 hour minimum wage and $26 an hour wage is stark. In addition, the National Low Income Housing Coalition says that in our market, it takes $19.08 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Finally, to quote from the Columbus Women's Commission, the main barriers for women are access to living wage jobs, workplace policies that are not family friendly, and lack of access to childcare and transportation. I would point out that these issues were discussed, solutions were being pieced together pre-pandemic, but the pandemic has ripped any Band-Aids we had on these issues. And it is our hope that we as a community and business leaders can focus more urgency on solving these issues going forward. Now, my colleague, Jung Kim, gave us a great overview of the Central Ohio economy, and I won't try to repeat him, but I do have some more local data on what we are seeing in the unemployment space. This slide captures just a small fraction of where we were in February and where we are now. You can see that Central Ohio was near full employment at 3.8%. I'm sure you heard in the news that the volume of unemployment claims filed, especially from March through June, was incredibly high. And Columbus was not immune. And the majority of jobs affected were in the food service and accommodation sector. And I think Jung pointed that out. Also, where March through June, we saw a lot of furloughs, which is temporary unemployment. Since June, we also are seeing more permanent layoffs. I also want to point out to you that when you look at unemployment numbers, they do not fully reflect who is unemployed. There are people who have dropped out of the workforce and stopped looking for work. I'm sure you've heard in the news, for example, that women in particular are dropping out of the workforce due to caregiving issues, mainly with children who are not in school full time. Although we have an idea, as you will see, how this plays out locally, we may not truly know for a few more months. I'm going to show you percentages to give you some idea of the continuing effect of unemployment. This data is specific to the city of Columbus based on information that the board is privy to with the state. You can see from this chart, based on numbers as of September 12th, that definitely it's the accommodation sector that has had one of the biggest losses of jobs. Actually, food and service preparation has seen huge losses, but administrative jobs and administrative support have also seen large drops. This chart shows current claim levels here in the city of Columbus, actually, as of September 12th, which is the last date we have right now. Our experience and the numbers are showing that African-American women have been the most impacted. As an aside, based on our investments at the Job Center before the pandemic, our typical client is actually an African-American woman with post-secondary credentials who engages with us in additional training and is reemployed. I also want to highlight that the impacted range is across the board, and I was raring to blurt that out. We do also have data for people over the age of 54, of which I am one. So I'm always interested in that data, but the majority, the bulk of people right now that are filing claims are between 25 and 54. Now, I know you can't, the other thing I want to tell you before we move on, soon we will have a dashboard thanks to the mayor's involvement in the Mayoral Education and Learning Network as part of his membership in the U.S. Conference of Mayors. That dashboard will show us where people of color are underrepresented in occupations and industry sectors in Columbus. and we will share that with you as soon as we have it all together. We plan to work with our community and business partners to improve diversity in those sectors and occupations, and counsel our job seekers, who are people of color, regarding where job opportunities are for them in high-wage occupations with great pathways. But we don't have that right now, so that's just going to have to be a preview at this point. And finally, I know this slide is hard to see. This data takes us into October for the city of Columbus. Actually, I think this is for Franklin County as a whole. And it shows where we are seeing higher claims. And right now, you can see in October, it is personal care and then production. Those are the two highest at the moment. And that has varied. As if you look across, you can see that's varied. Excuse me. Okay, our last virtual hiring event was just last week. And I think some of the stats I've pulled out are pretty indicative of what we're seeing. Now, 61% of the participants in the virtual hiring event were female. 44% of them were between the ages of 40 and 59. Most striking, 74% of them had some college, bachelor's, 3 of them had PhDs even. So that is really different than what we have seen previous to this particular event. So we aren't quite sure what that's telling us, but I thought I would share it. And then, of course, you know, as the workforce system, our final concern is going to be children, because they are our emerging workforce. I don't have to say, and it's already been brought up by Kyle, that we are concerned about children, especially children of color and children in our more disadvantaged neighborhoods, as to whether those families have been willing, and they may be willing, but they haven't been able to make sure their children are fully engaged when school is at a hybrid or a virtual delivery system. You know that challenges include access to the internet, parents not being able to work from home, or are challenged with being teachers in addition to working, whether they are working at home or having to continue to be frontline or working in low income wage jobs. So we also know that violence has increased in our most vulnerable neighborhoods, and that violence has involved children. So we have recommendations further on, but obviously I know I'm speaking to the choir when I say we have to focus on engaging children in education and exposure to these opportunities. We need to be on that now, and we will need to more than triple down our efforts as we come out of the pandemic. I'm going to turn it over to Bo now, and Bo is going to talk about what's going on in the workforce system right now. Bo?
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you also for the opportunity to present, and thank you for serving on this committee. This is very important work, and certainly we want to make sure that as we recover, that we do it in a way in which all people get to participate fully in a shared prosperity. And in order for us to do that, we really have to be looking through the lens of collective impact. How do we bring our community together and focused on this from a systems thinking perspective? So with that in mind, a number of workforce development providers in the nonprofit space came together to align our resources. You see a list here of some of those nonprofit workforce development providers, as well as government sectors, and then some who are tangentially related, such as the Community Shelter Board, United Way, and things of that nature. This is not an exhaustive list. Our thought is that we want to expand the circle to include other providers, but we started with this core group and came together for a purpose. Next slide, please. We came together and created a charter, and our focus is really around how do we create a collaborative system in which we can share resources and information and best practices and make sure to share advice with the Central Ohio region about how we create this comprehensive workforce development system with more targeted strategies to training people for the jobs that are actually paying a living wage. And so you see here that we have embraced the collective impact model to create a seamless workforce development system that ensures every individual has the opportunity to thrive and has access to career pathways that will allow for economic and social mobility. So with that, just to give a quick overview of the 5 conditions of collective impact on the next slide. We are working together and have all put some skin in the game and are going to be working with a facilitator from Fraser Hybe, who is going to take us through really drilling down on this collective impact model and determining how do we make sure that we've identified the gaps in our community in terms of workforce training, as well as how do we make sure that we're not duplicating services. So we want to make sure that we're taking a comprehensive and systemic approach to providing workforce development training and connecting that training and those credentials to the needs of employers. And so having that data about where the jobs are shifting, how they're shifting, even in the retail space, there were some losses, but there were obviously some gains. And so there's a shift that's taking place in the workforce, and we need to make sure that as workforce development providers, that we're staying ahead of that curve in preparing all people for the jobs of the future. And so we have embraced this collective impact model. We are working with a couple of tools to make it easy for us to share information. We're using SharePoint and Microsoft Power BI. Each of the organizations previously listed has shared their data. We entered into a data sharing agreement so that we could share all of that information and then be real clear about what the issues are that we're trying to address and solve. This work will be ongoing, and it is a subcommittee of the Workforce Development Board of Central Ohio. And as we work through our strategic planning, that period will start from November 1st through February. Once we clarify our strategic direction and those goals, then we will be looking to bring on new partners so that we truly can have a systemic approach to addressing workforce in Central Ohio. I'm going to apologize up front. I have an impact board meeting that I need to lead, so I'm going to hop off of here. I'm going to kick it over to Beth Gifford to do a drill down on what it looks like on the ground with what we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you, Bo. Mr. Mayor, members of council, members of the committee, thank you for having my colleagues, Lisa, Pat McDaniel, and Bo Chilton and I come today and share with you what we're seeing as we work with our neighbors. It's a blessing to us to be able to work with our neighbors who find themselves in not only a pandemic, who would have ever thought we'd be living through a pandemic, but also a significant economic crisis. And so at Columbus Works, if you're not familiar with us, we are about eliminating poverty through workforce training, job placement, and 5 to 7 years of long-term wraparound support. We're place-based. We go to the neighborhoods that need us most, where there's low labor participation rates and high poverty rates compared to the rest of the county or the city. And I'll share that 60% of the individuals we work with, a little over 60% are Black or brown, 65% are women, and 30% have a post-high school education. Next slide, Lisa. Thank you. So, we noticed the impact of COVID-19 in 3 different, I thought in terms of pillars. We noticed the impact on our neighbors, our Columbus Works members. We notice it on our community and on our employer partners. We work with over 90 employer partners inside 270 who hire Columbus Works members. So I'm going to address it through this lens, through their lens. The next slide, please. The impact we're seeing has been palpable not only palpable, but life-changing for our members and for our support partners. When the governor, with Dr. Acton, shut down Ohio, the state home order, we moved quickly to a virtual platform and learned that the digital divide is real. And what that means is that our neighbors who were stuck in low-wage jobs or chronically unemployed and wanted to change their life and get engaged in employment in a sustainable way no longer had access to training, no longer had access to Wi-Fi or internet to apply online for jobs, and there were open jobs still, particularly in essential jobs, and were really had no way to engage in jobs that had been sent for remote work. Suddenly, not only is the digital divide there, but it becomes, it created, magnified the wage gap tremendously. We, in this period, we have increased our referrals for mental health by 75% over the same period last year. Food assistance and eviction prevention. These referrals are significantly higher. There's a great deal of worry and fear that we're seeing among the folks that we serve in Central Ohio. The most shocking to me has been the angst of our particularly working moms who have young school-age children who began to call in. Our lines were just jam-packed and say, what am I going to do? I'm in an essential job. I have to go to work. I've been working now, sustained employment, and I've come off of subsidies. I'm beginning to get to self-sufficiency. I'm making more money. But if I leave my child at home, and I'll get into this more, do I work or do I pay the rent? And it's been quite shocking. And then the benefits cliff. We all are aware of it. It's real. We create a predictable journey for the individuals with whom we're working, but it has been magnified, and their ability, they're on their way to self-sufficiency and the opportunities to build wealth for generations in their household. But when COVID hit and the economy changed and came to a screeching halt, that benefits cliff, it was just magnified in a way I've never seen before. And I've been working in the workforce space in some fashion for decades. Lisa, next slide. I quoted one of our members when this all started with the economic shutdown and the changes, and we are still hearing this. One of our coaches asked me to get on a call with her with one of our members, and I will never forget the panic in this mother's voice as she said, if I leave my children home alone, Children's Services is going to come and get them. And if I don't go to work, I can't pay the rent, I'm going to get evicted. What am I supposed to do? And I would like to tell you that even as the economy opened up, that went away, but it's not true. I was at an event last week, a Zoom event, and one of the speakers, I don't know this is a statistic, so just take it anecdotally, shared that on any given day, a very high percentage of, he quoted 80% of Columbus City school students are not logging on. Parents are, they're trying to work just to keep things going. And the skills gap, as they're, the individuals with whom we work don't have the skills to take advantage of the booming economy that was happening in Central Ohio and the Columbus MSA even before the COVID impact on the economy. But now that skills gap is magnified 10 times because of lack of Wi-Fi, trying to work and homeschool at the same time. Now you want me to take a class in something, none of us could do that. And so our goal at Columbus Works is poverty elimination. So the members with whom we work, these are their goals, and they're working, they're sustaining employment, they're earning more. But when COVID hit, it brought all of this to a screeching halt. And if we don't interject ourselves here, there will be an entire generations will be impacted, an entire group of the workforce will be impacted, and their children, and it will have a very long-term ramification, in my opinion. Lisa, next slide, please. So I've also seen an impact on our community. Work is a social determinant of health. And so we not only have folks who are not taking care of their own health, but they're also fearful. They're fearful to go to work because of COVID. They're fearful of losing their job, or they have to make decisions because now I've hit the benefits cliff, and it's cheaper for me not to work right now than to try to find daycare. And we also see hunger. I never thought that in my city in 2020 we would be dealing with hunger. We have the neighborhoods in which we have learning centers have food deserts. And so now we have children home from school going through the food faster. We have pantries with reduced hours, and it has created actual real hunger issues. And so we say to our neighbors, why aren't you moving up in employment? Why aren't you taking advantage of this booming economy in Central Ohio? And I would say to you, it's impossible to think about moving up or being fully engaged at work when you're hungry. And you ask any mom, they're going to feed their children first. And so that's been significant. All of this has a generational impact. We are seeing a significant crisis in that there is not appropriate care for particularly young elementary school children whose parents now need to try to go to work, first or second shift, and homeschool. Although as a mother of sons, I will tell you, if I had left my teenage boys at home alone and said, here, do your homework, I don't think it will have gone well. And so I think often about the high school students as well. Columbus Works, our average age is 35, but we're working with more 18 to 24-year-old unaccompanied homeless youth. And absent an excellent education, we are going to lose them. And often they have children. This has a generational impact, and we really must interject ourselves and walk alongside them and come up with solutions that are really going to lift our neighbors who otherwise are going to get swallowed by this crisis. We also, as a solution, I would suggest we need a shorter road to the certification for qualification for employment, because sometimes having a background or being recovering or re-entering or justice involved in some fashion, there's a lot of decisions made on the employer side that are detrimental to folks who want to move ahead. So from a policy perspective, I'd really like to see us impact the cycle time to achieve the CQE. And I'm with Lisa on this. If we do not interject ourselves here, we're going to lose an already at-risk high school student group. And this is our viable workforce of the future, which brings me to the next slide, Lisa. The impact on economic development. Bloomberg had already written quite a bit about is America running out of workers. The labor participation rate, in my view, is significant. The unemployment rate, these are people who already know how to go to work. They've been working, they're collecting unemployment benefits, and I'm not minimizing their plight. I'm saying those folks who are not counted who are not in the labor force. So the labor participation rate pre-COVID was 63%. It's 61.4, 61 point something now, which means that more 18 to 64-year-olds not incarcerated, not on disability, have said no to the labor force. They've just stopped. There is an economic poverty, but there's a poverty of hope. And we're seeing much more of this poverty of hope. The number of job openings is far greater than people able to fill them. And so our focus is to engage those folks who are not participating in the labor force on a regular basis or chronically unemployed for whatever reason, and transition them into fully engaged workers. And I will tell you, because I know from past professional experience, all of these great companies coming to Central Ohio will leave if we do not provide for them a viable workforce, and not just for now, a workforce for the future with the skills they need. We are placing people into patient-facing jobs, robotics jobs, STEM jobs, particularly around IT, and artificial intelligence. And if we don't interject ourselves and engage young people, engage those not in the labor force, and provide that training and a path to those living wage jobs and career path higher wage jobs, companies will not stay here. And this is my city. I don't mean this in a hateful way in any fashion. I'm a Columbus girl, and I think we ought to be the best at everything we're doing. And so I would just share that from a workforce perspective, we really have a desire to be engaged and help be part of the solution. And I appreciate that you all have allowed us to share this afternoon. I'll hand this back over to Hannah or Christy.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Lisa. And Bo, of course, had to leave. I know we have, we're a little bit over time, but I do want, if there are a few questions, perhaps if you all could stay just a few more minutes, just to, answer maybe a few questions from the committee. And then I will also direct the committee to add any questions they may have to the chat so that Hannah can capture them, and we can be sure to get these over to Lisa and Beth and Bo. Questions?
And I just want to point out, I'll leave the slide. These are our recommendations, some of our recommendations. So I know we're running out of time, but you'll have this, and I encourage you to look at them.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa. Hannah, make note, Lisa has set the bar that those that are coming forward are giving us their recommendations. I think Kerwin did the same thing, and actually that's very helpful to the committee as we endeavor to do some of our work after the first phase. Are there any, Annie Ross-Womack has a question. Annie?
Thank you, Christy. How are we engaging with job readiness, with Impact, Columbus Works, and workforce development? How are we engaging with labor? Because that seems to be one of our largest roadblocks with labor industry. So how are we working with the unions, with our young men and women who are trying to go into skilled trades and labor without that big roadblock of the union? How are we working with that?
Yeah, so Annie, that's a great question. And I wish Bo was still on here, but certainly I don't know if Stephanie Hightower is on here. She's actually involved in it now. But the county generously funded Building Futures. And Building Futures is a program, specifically, it's a pre-apprenticeship, which if a participant engages and completes it, they are guaranteed into one of the trades. Absolutely, 14 of them have come together. I believe it's 14. So what we're doing is, if somebody doesn't have the aptitude immediately to go directly into an apprenticeship program, what we're doing is we are putting them through Building Futures. And Building Futures, I forget, and if Stephanie's on here, maybe she can remind me of how many weeks it is, but essentially it's making sure that the participants have the right math and literacy skills to be successful in the apprenticeship. They spend the end of their time in Building Futures investigating all of the different trades, and then they choose the trade they're going to go in. I believe Building Futures is on its fourth or fifth cohort. The cohorts are typically around 25. And so it's specifically geared towards people who are underrepresented in the trades. And now certainly we can, I mean, that is a great model, and we presented it in other parts of the country as a way to help support people into the trades.
Yeah. Is there another question?
Chrissy, it's Elizabeth. I had a question. I've been trying to figure out how to raise my hand in the chat here. So just jumping in here. So quick question, both Lisa and Beth have talked about, there was a comment earlier about the long-term sustainability plan, making sure that it's inclusive of children as we consider them as the future workforce pipeline. And so my question is probably just a general question, maybe even guided to you, Christy. As I look at the committee's two focus areas around both human services and economic recovery, I'm curious about whether the scope of work that we're going to be engaging in terms of recommendation will specifically highlight that as a focus. The way that I see children represented here, obviously through the adult filter, but childcare is probably the only place where I see that. So just wanted some feedback from you on that.
Well, and you may have missed some of our earlier remarks. So we have worked with the city and the county directly on some of the specific areas in which we are going to be offering advice and guidance. This first phase, we're listening, we're hearing from the experts, in which some of you are experts. You'll bring some comments forward. There have been comments in the chat. The second phase will go into work groups. We'll have some facilitated discussions, and we'll start to think about priorities and so forth. Some of those things will be things that government, or we will be making recommendations back to the city and the county that they can do. And some of those things will be things that the private sector and the nonprofit sector have to do, that we have to take action on. Some of those will have policy implications. And so this is designed so that when we get to that phase, right, we'll be forced to make choices, right? There will be priorities, there will be things that we need to do, and there will be policies that we'll want to, talk about changing. I would also like to say that Trudy Bartley's on this call. Trudy chaired, and Sandy Doyle Ahern, I know specifically both of them are involved with the Rise Together Blueprint. The Rise Together Blueprint also addresses a lot of the issues that have been raised in the chat around public assistance, how people fall off the cliff or get thrown off the cliff, education and the like. We are not to duplicate. We're not here to duplicate, right? Trudy can also speak to this. She and I talk about the intersections often of this type of work. And so, it may mean, Hannah, at some point that Joy has to come. We want Joy and Trudy to give us just a quick blueprint overview. But we want to make sure that we're aligned and where we want to refer back policies to the county that may intersect with the blueprint, we'll do that. And where there are some of the other areas that we think need further discussion, we'll also make those recommendations. The areas that we are directly looking at are those areas specifically that the county commissioner, the mayor, and the council president want us to look at this time. So while you see childcare being addressed and digital divide, because those are two that certainly through some of the data that the city and the county have reviewed, they are bubbling up. They are recognizing that we're losing possibly an industry of businesses and so forth, but we are not taking on perhaps education, K-12, big picture. Future Ready's doing a lot of that work as well. So, I don't mean to, I'm not trying to stifle conversation, but I do want us to keep, be mindful of what, those that have brought us forward, what they want us to look at. And it's important in these kinds of processes that we do try to stay to that, but then also be mindful that we can also make recommendations for other changes in other areas that we're not looking at. And then also the intersections of some of the areas where the work is already being done.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. We're 10 minutes over time. It's going to be our goal to try and land the plane, I like to say. No pun intended to our airport people. They don't want me landing planes, but nevertheless, we're going to try and land the plane and get in on time as much as we can, because we know you're all busy and we all have probably 3 times the work that we've had previously, just given the time that we are in with this pandemic. So I want to thank you for being here for the first session. Our next session is on, Hannah, remind me, it's on Tuesday, I believe, November 10th, because we are not going to meet on Veterans Day. Am I correct?
That is correct.
Tuesday at 3:30. And we will hear from, I can't remember who's on the list, food insecurity and housing will be addressed in the next hearing. And again, please continue to put things in the chat, or you can send emails to Hannah and myself so that we can capture some of the other things if we missed it, or questions for today's panelists. And of course, we'll be mindful of those other areas that people want us to look at when we get to the second phase of the work. thank you all for being there and being here today with us. And we really appreciate your time and willingness to serve.